Hello again, and welcome to All Things Conflict with me, Maria Arpa, your host. Today, I'm welcoming Michelle Cox. Michelle Cox is a race equality consultant. She's also a fellow with the Royal College of Nursing, has a very important lived experience of race discrimination and Employment Tribunal. I'm thrilled that she's given some time to bring us some insight and wisdom. Michelle, welcome to All Things Conflict. Thank you so much for guesting on the show. I mean, we only met a few weeks ago, but I felt like we were kindred spirits, really.
Certainly felt the same, Maria. Thank you.
Oh, so nice. Well, and you know, you're awesome. So I can't wait for our listeners to know more about you and your story. So are you okay if I just kick off with a question?
Absolutely.
So you took the very bold step of, taking the NHS to Employment Tribunal, and there isn't an employment lawyer in the country who hasn't heard of your case. But I would love you to just take me back to a time before the idea that you would take anyone to tribunal or have a problem in the workplace. Just give me a little kind of introduction to that time.
Okay. Well, before considering any formal action, I was deeply committed to my role as a senior Black nurse within the NHS. It was so far away from my conscience. I still pinch myself that the process that then happened and ensued actually did. It was never in my conscience. I believe in the NHS, I believe in its core values, and I believe in providing equitable healthcare for all. That's part of the mission of the NHS. I approached my work with dedication. I take my code of conduct as a nurse really seriously. And I assumed that my contribution to my team, to the whole ethos of the NHS, was valued. And I was to find otherwise, unfortunately. The principles of fairness, inclusion, and equity, everything that I believed in, I was having to challenge. It feels like sometimes I was going around like I was the equality police, but that is absolutely not the case. I was actually in a role to challenge systems and processes to ensure fairness, to prevent discrimination happening, particularly to Black nurses and midwives. That was a role that I proudly applied for and delivered since 2018. And I reported directly to the Chief Nursing Officer of England on matters pertaining to Black and ethnic minority staff and issues impacting on the community as well. So when things started happening to me, from things that I was potentially fighting for, I couldn't be true to myself. I couldn't be true in this role. And I actually thought that I was senior enough to be listened to and heard by those in positions of power. And I thought they would.
So if I've understood you, part of your role, I mean, you're in nursing, you've always taken the values and ethics of nursing really seriously, the code of conduct, but a part of your role was actually to talk about and challenge and improve relations and inclusion and awareness around these topics within the system.
Absolutely. And being the only Black nurse within the organisation, I was often the go-to person to resolve conflicts, to sit on interview panels to ensure fairness in the recruitment and the appointment of members of staff. Often if there was a grievance, I would give it the once over to see if the response was fair, proportionate. And if we got it wrong, be brave enough to say, we've got it wrong and we need to apologise. So I
So
was
the
never.
word that really sticks out to me is fairness. Like everything around what you were doing, how you were conducting yourself, how you were looking at situations in the workplace was all about fairness and honesty. So the idea that things were happening to you, it's almost preposterous.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's no other word for it. In my 30 years career in the NHS, I've often led on initiatives and projects for Black and ethnic minority communities, whether it be we've done that something a few years ago around calcium and vitamin D deficiency within the Somali communities of Liverpool. I've led on the female genital mutilation programme, education and awareness, working across many sectors, health, local authorities, education and schools. I was always the go-to person. That's certainly how it felt. I didn't do it with any resistance. I'd done it because, one, I knew that I had the knowledge, I had the contacts, I worked with communities, and I believe I was credible to be delivering on some of these programs.
Yeah, so as the only Black woman in your organisation, I guess there was a sort of natural kind of deference to your knowledge, your wisdom, and out in the community of how to make healthcare more accessible, more fair, for people to be able to access the services that, that are the public services that we've all paid for, in our
Absolutely.
taxes and as being part of a community.
Yes, and probably it's a different take on what nursing is about. But I've been a nurse most of, if not all of my career has been working in the community with communities, bringing issues of unfairness, unjust policies that don't always work for communities, breaking down those barriers. A number of years ago, I was the regional lead for asylum seekers and refugees, and understanding the particular issues that they have in navigating systems, just trying to access a GP. I was also the lead for interpreting and translation services, making sure that all voices are heard and not being frightened to stand up in spaces and say, we need to relook at our policies here. We need to do equality impact assessments. And I believed that I was always listened to. I've had, I'm not saying that all of my 30 years was a bad experience, far from it. I was listened to when I faced racism previously, but there comes a point where you can just take it no more. We talk about the straw that broke the camel's back, and this incident, which was escalating and behaviours were getting worse, I could no longer stay quiet.
I really get that. I get this sense, nobody does a 30-year
No,
career and hates every minute of it kind
no,
of thing.
no,
And
no.
I really get this sense that you went into something and what comes to me is you poured your heart into it,
Yeah,
like to do it the best way you could, to be of service, to serve a higher purpose. That's the word. That's what I'm looking for. I get this sense of you serving a higher purpose. And
yeah.
in serving a higher purpose, sometimes you'll have to speak truth to power.
Yes, yeah,
And then I also, just to backpedal a little bit, I heard you say that when things started to happen to you, you believed that you had the seniority to be taken seriously or to be able to address these issues and these matters in a sort of, I'm going to say tongue in cheek, like in a grown up way.
yes, yeah, all of that.
So then there must have come a point when you realised that you were getting nowhere, or worse still, not only were you getting nowhere, but your own integrity was being crushed, or your own soul was being destroyed. That something happens inside, and I suppose I'm interested in that. You said the straw that broke the camel's back, and then how you decided, how you turned it round, what state you were in.
Yeah. Well, initially, I approached the individuals directly. Didn't start off with a grievance. I thought the power of my voice and saying, this is wrong, can you understand, would have been enough. That then progressed into a mediation. And that was probably the most horrific experience in terms of being listened to and being heard. And I do a lot of work now with HR departments in many sectors. And I say, think very carefully around suggesting mediation. You know, you've often got a 2-hour session. You're not being heard. There's a lot of defensiveness. And somebody who has particular traits around being racist or has discriminatory practices or continues with the microaggressions isn't going to change the behaviours in a 2-hour meeting. But, we do it because that's what the policy suggests, that we go into mediation. So I followed all of the policies. And I began to encounter subtle yet persistent forms of discrimination and bias. And despite raising the initial concerns, I was left with no option but to do a formal grievance. And a period of time had passed. And I went through all of the appropriate channels. I never stepped out of line. I followed the policy, but behaviours were getting worse. I think what's also clear to understand is when you have to make the decision that this is potentially going to end up in a court case because I'm not being listened to, there's a lot of defensiveness around what I'm saying. No one seems to understand, and almost losing sight of the very issues that I'm bringing to the table in the beginning. So if I'm talking about unfair recruitment practices, if I'm talking about independence and a nursing framework that I was working within, I expect those to be addressed, not behaviours to get worse. And I was really, and this was impacting on my mental health. I was saying, well, show me in the policy where it says you can do what you want to do, but nobody could show me the policy. And of an evening, I would sit and I'd read recruitment policies. I would read appointments, fixed terms, secondments, stretched assignments. I'd read all of these policies to understand how people could be promoted in the way that I was witnessing. In 30 years, I've never been given a job. Never been given a job. I've always had to apply. I've been to assessment centres. I've been to 3-stage interview panels with presentations. But in the particular instance that I was raising an issue, people are arguing with me, well, we had some slippage money and we picked the best person for the job and we gave it to them. And it's only till the end of March, as if that was okay. And what you often find is the end of March comes and the individuals don't go back to the substantive position. They almost stay there because they'll find some more slippage money. And then that person has an advantage over other individuals over the team because they can put on their CV that they've worked at a higher grade for an amount of time on a piece of work. This was not just about myself. There were other individuals in the team that could have applied had the job been fairly advertised, and that didn't happen. That was just one of the issues that I was bringing to the table. But to argue that you can do it, I think the issue is senior leaders have been practicing like that for many, many years, never been called out on it, continue to do it. It almost becomes the norm, but it wasn't the norm. And this is now impacting not just on me, but my reputation, my integrity. And I was a role model for Black nurses within the organisation. I had no choice but to call it out. And as I go back to my point earlier, I'm a registered nurse. I hold a code of conduct with the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and discrimination is one of those codes that I cannot stand by and allow.
So there's a whole sort of melting pot of things going on at that time.
Mm-hmm.
One is your own integrity, and then then beginning to notice. So I'm guessing there's a place when these things happen where you tell yourself, you try to sort of say, no, I'm imagining it, or, and then you realise you're not imagining it. And then you have to get wise, you have to start saying, as you said, you're reading policies at night, trying to put the map together, trying to put the jigsaw together. And then you see this picture, and you've just named like one incident of several things that were going on that suddenly paint a picture of something that you can't just do nothing about, because especially in the position that you were in, there were other people relying on you to call it out. Relying on you. And it's really interesting, because when I meet people like you who've taken these kind of brave steps and spoken truth to power, it's often that somebody has to take that role to create the change. And it's a kind of like, I'm using the word sacrifice in a higher purpose way. You make that sacrifice because you may have found the bravery or the capacity, or it's a position in life where you can actually now take this step, because other people will suffer if you don't.
Yes. And I think all important to note, I was born in the 60s. My father is from the Windrush generation, a black man from the Caribbean. My mother was a white woman. I grew up understanding racism very, very early in my life. Some of the worst racism that I ever experienced was walking with my white mother. I have aunties who were also nurses from the Caribbean. My mother was also a nurse. I'm from a family of nurses, and they couldn't speak up. I heard those stories as a little girl growing up. Passed over the promotion, put on the night shift, missed out on training, the exclusion. They couldn't speak up. And there's been a time in my career that I haven't been able to speak up and almost passed it off as poor behaviours. It's not racism. It can't be racism. It's an ugly word. So to get to a position that I'm now using the word, I knew once I said it, there was no going back. And I knew the consequences of what was going to happen by saying it. I wasn't naive. And I currently support many staff, mainly in the NHS, but not exclusively. I support police officers, social workers from all walks of life. And one of the questions I ask is, you do understand the consequences of doing what I did, going to court. It can be career ending and career destroying. And the advice that I would give to somebody in their 20s is not the same advice I'd give to somebody in the 50s who's got, someone who's a lot younger, may have another 10, 20, 30 years ahead of them. But I was coming potentially to the end of my career. I wasn't exactly in the winter of my career, but was certainly coming to the autumn. And I thought I would rather sign on for benefits now than continue to work in an environment whose very nature, they don't align with me anymore. And I stand on the shoulders of others that have gone before me that couldn't speak up. And come what may, then so be it. That was almost my attitude, and that driving force behind my decision to take action was a profound sense of responsibility to advocate for systemic change.
Oh, I just want to take a deep breath as I, sort of allow that to land, and that responsibility for systemic change. Because in the end, it's all about power dynamics.
Yeah.
And, I heard you talk about mediation earlier, and I just want to row back to that because, mediation is becoming it's having its moment, it's becoming fashionable. And, I'm a mediator of 30 odd years.
Okay.
But, in the workplace, it only has certain uses. And I'm very clear about mediating where there are power imbalances. Because, as so astutely said, anyone can put on a show for 2 hours.
Yeah.
And actually, what you may be doing, one of the things I've learned is as a mediator, one of the things you could be doing is giving the person with more power even more information to intimidate somebody in even more secret ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, not all mediators understand discrimination themselves.
Well, that's yes. Well, that we could do a whole episode on that, on
Yeah,
diversity in the mediation industry,
yeah.
or the lack of.
Yeah, exhausting to be put in that position of trying to explain why something potentially is racist, trying to almost do an education session on protected characteristics and yeah.
Yes, and the reason that we have protected characteristics. I mean, you've just reminded me, and I think I think it's a sort of timely thing. I'd love to talk about. I was facing an organisation, a sort of international, with a report that clearly showed a sort of unconscious bias and racism, not intentionally, because racism isn't me calling you names, that's the very raw end, there's and talking to a group of people and saying, actually there are some real problems here, and this is how we need to work forward into the future, and being told, oh, but a lot of your questionnaires came from America, and we don't have the same problems with racism in Europe. and how do you even begin a conversation around that?
Absolutely. And whilst my grievance started in 2019, 2020 was the year that we saw the disproportionate number of deaths for Black and ethnic minorities during COVID. We saw the death of George Floyd, the execution, really, of George Floyd. It was almost like the veil had been lifted, and there was no going back for me then.
No, absolutely.
I was almost on this journey that I couldn't get off. And despite all the promises from senior leaders, all of the speeches that were made, Black Lives Matter, I did have a tiny bit of hope. If my complaint is going to go anywhere, maybe they will listen differently now, because the world is screaming around racism, discrimination, unfairness, injustices. They may just hear my complaint differently. But the speeches still went ahead and still nobody listened. There was a decision made somewhere to take me to court. There was a decision not to listen. And I think organisations get quite, don't like to use the word bullish, but they think that they're going to win, because usually they do win.
Usually they win, and what happens is, if you're a dissenter, I've seen this, and particularly in public services, those kinds of structures, or even in corporate, what happens is all the people on one side go shoulder to shoulder, and the dissenter, you start to see this ravine open up, the abyss. And you're pushed further and further and further away until until the idea is that you disappear or fall in, or you're obliterated in some way. Yeah, so can I just shift the focus a little bit? Is that okay? To talk a little bit about, and I don't want to go into your case, and I certainly don't want you to relive it, but But, that decision, and then here's a employment tribunal coming up, and, perhaps you can help people by talking about the experience of it and, what the alternatives are, how to not get there in the first place.
Yeah, I hoped upon hope that somebody would have reached out and said, let's have a conversation. I was open all of the time to a conversation to move me into a different department, a conversation to let me exit the organisation. I was open to all of that, but none of those things happened. I was supported with a union, the Royal College of Nursing, and a fantastic barrister, Cloisters Barristers in London. I have to mention them because I don't think I possibly would have won without their skill, their expertise, their ability to turn my story into a legal argument. I am not a lawyer, I'm a nurse, and whilst I knew I was experiencing racism, lots of cases that go to court, really, really strong cases, go to court, they don't win because of the inability to put a legal test case forward. And that legal team that I had, they carried me for the 20 months. That's how long it took from filing my ET1 or the pre-hearing to the full hearing. They carried me. There was a time I couldn't even string a sentence together. My mental health took a decline. So all of that case management, collecting emails, putting a case forward, articulating what I couldn't articulate, that wouldn't have happened had I not had the support of the Royal College of Nursing. 20 months can have a significant impact. You're alone. We were in a period of COVID. We weren't communicating, but I wasn't meeting people. And I was reliving, re-traumatizing myself, going over and over what was said, when, how, who was my witnesses, collating all of that evidence into a bundle. I think it was 4 folders deep by the time I got to the courtroom. But being able to, I almost became anal over the detail. Every little detail, I could take you from page 7 to page 780. I knew the bundle back to front, which came into play because I was able to move across the bundle as I'm telling the story, producing the evidence, giving the context and background to some of the suggestions that were being made. And then being put into that situation of being in a courtroom, almost in a dock, like I was a criminal. This was meant to be an employment tribunal, but you're made to feel that you're a criminal for daring to call out racism or calling individuals racist. Policies, behaviours, attitudes, they all come into play into the Macpherson definition of institutionalised racism. And whilst I was successful, and some people will call it a landmark win, because I didn't only achieve vindication in direct and indirect discrimination, but I was able to show unconscious bias, unconscious discrimination, still discrimination, whistleblowing, detriments for whistleblowing. They all played into the bigger picture of what my case was about, making it a landmark case. And I don't like to use the word win because there were no winners. A lot of people got hurt, continue to be hurt, continue to the aftermath of something so high profile. My face on the front of the national newspapers. It made it into all of the nursing journals, legal journals, HR journals, hounded by the press at one point. I had to leave the country just to get a break from it. And then the impact on your family, your friends, some of them who supported me through the journey, some who didn't support me through the journey. I don't hold a grudge, but some of the people that held me aren't the people that I was expected to be at the final line. It's changed me as a person. I'll never be the go-free person that I once was. I have a diagnosis of PTSD, and that plays out in all areas of my life, unfortunately. The long-lasting impacts.
These things change you. They do change us. It's hard to believe that you can go from well-purposed intentioned, nursing. I mean, what's more noble than nursing? To do something that's, it's not a job, is it? It's a dedication. Yeah. It's a calling. Yeah. It's a vocational. Yeah. To be in that state of dedication and service, and then to, never in your wildest dreams would you have imagined. But yet, I think the thing for me is in listening to you is that inner pendulum, the pendulum that comes to rest and says, actually, this is not okay. It's not okay. Your sort of moral compass, if you like, and while these things were happening to you, it feels to me, the sense I have is that you were the model on behalf of everyone else that it was happening to, and continues to happen to. But what a shame as humans, forget NHS, forget, people behaving badly or whatever. What a shame as humans. The most important thing I heard, and our time's coming to an end, is, I heard you say loud and clear, you hoped above hope that somebody was going to reach out and have a conversation with you. I mean, how do we get here? And it does change you. And I'd love to spend a minute or two on what you're doing now. But just, can you just speak to that? People who are embarking on this, whether it's from the employer side or the employee side, what's your message? What would you rather people did? I mean, sometimes it's going to be necessary to test things in court, okay? For one reason or another, it's going to be necessary because that's sometimes how you force change. But if there's an alternative, what would you recommend?
Well, firstly, I would always, from an employee point of view, make sure that you're in a union. And I know some unions get hard times not supporting staff. However, you have to take on the unions. But not being in a union, I think it's almost impossible. There are those cases of litigants in person that win. However, being a union will take on the unions. Otherwise, you need to have deep pockets to fund the lawyers, the barristers, the paralegals, and everybody else involved in putting a case together. I continue to say, speak up and speak out. We won't find change by keeping quiet because it's not the right time. And that's easy for me to say when I didn't always speak up myself. Got to feel psychologically safe to be able to do so. And organisations really need to listen to staff when they're brave enough to come forward with an issue. Very rarely do staff come forward and say, I'm experiencing racism. They come forward with another issue. Racism is the output of something else, something deeper ingrained. And managers quite often lose sight of what's being said and focus on, let's fight the allegation of racism. We need at all cost to defend our own reputations. We'll fight that and forget the other. And that's the wrong way to do it. When you're doing investigations, make sure that people have got the absolute skills to investigate racism. And it is a different skill set than being an investigator of a grievance that doesn't cite racism. Bring in the external companies if you need to, because to get it wrong is not just damaging for the organisation, it's crucifying for the individual. having to go through a grievance. Quite often they have to go through an appeal, and then they have to go through an employment tribunal. And quite often these processes are running in parallel. You cannot wait for the outcome of your grievance to then start an employment tribunal process. You have 89 days from the act complained of. And we all know that grievances are not heard and investigated within 89 days. You have to run both processes to maintain your time limits.
Yes, wise words. And I love that, particularly that people don't come along and say, I'm experiencing racism. It doesn't show itself in that way often. It starts somewhere else. And if I hear you correctly, what you're advocating for employers is listen more carefully, learn to listen from our humanity. Not listening from what do we have to defend, but listen from our humanity, and then we can have an honest conversation. And these conversations can be informal and confidential, and we can do things in stages. I mean, these are all the things that I talk about. So just in wrapping up, what are you doing now? Like where are you? How do people find you? What keeps you going?
I've set up my own consultancy company. I'm still registered as a nurse. I've recently become a fellow of the Royal College of Nursing and a fellow of the Queen's Nurse Institute. Probably my proudest moments within nursing, to be honest, to hold those titles. And I use them for the better good. So whilst I'm no longer nursing in the terms of seeing patients, I'm using all of those nursing skills to advise on policy, on research. I speak at many NHS boards around the risk to employment tribunals. I actually look at complaints and say, this is where the racism is, even though you can't see it. This is where I see it. So I ask people to, remain open and have an open view. I've just completed my third medical mission to Africa. So for the third year running, I've been to Ghana and Sierra Leone, working in the local villages, doing vaccination programs, public health, first aid, health promotion initiatives, deep into some of the villages, women's clinics. And I really love that part of giving back to communities that wish that they had some type of NHS but don't have anything. I love doing that. And I support NHS staff and staff from other fields with their grievances in the workplace. They'll often phone me just to tell me the story, someone that will listen and understand, somebody that can give them impartial advice. There's no gain in it for me, but I do tell them the brutal honesty of going down an employment tribunal route, and hopefully that they can get to the table with the senior leaders and understand that there is an opportunity here, that we can rectify something, we can move somebody on, move somebody out, or call in some of these poor behaviours. Not everything needs a huge investigation. We spend too much money investigating things when, if you just look at the evidence that's right in front of you, it doesn't need to be investigated, particularly when you've got witnesses. I have set up the Michelle Cox Anti-Racism Awards in partnership with the Royal College of Nursing Foundation, which is the charity arm of the RCN. And every year, an award is made of £2,500 to a nurse or a team to promote anti-racism projects. So that's now in its second year. It's funded for 10 years, and my aim is for it to be funded for the next 10 years as well. And I just get involved in lots of local activism work. I'm currently campaigning to keep the Liverpool African Caribbean Centre open. something that's hit the headlines in my local city, and things where I feel that I've got a voice that I can make a difference and give some issues a platform.
Wow. It just reminded me, I wish I'd known you a couple of years ago when I was supporting an African Caribbean community in Stonebridge
Oh, yeah.
for a centre that was sold to developers. But
Yeah.
a story for another day.
Yes,
But
yes.
look, your light shines very brightly, Michelle. I mean, despite everything you've been through, you're still giving service. I think what for me, I'm hoping that this podcast is watched by employees and employers, to give this kind of broader view, not just taking a side. And for me, any employer that's telling themselves, we don't have any problems with racism, you're probably the person to get in touch with.
Yeah, I support lots of industries, mainly the NHS. I don't want racism to be a dirty word. I want to be able to have that open conversation.
Yes, that's what matters,
And
isn't
put
it?
points of view across. Yeah, that's it. And employers can contact me, Michelle Cox 1 at co.uk.
Nice, lovely. Thank you so much. I've loved this conversation. I've loved meeting you, and I shall be coming up to find you in Liverpool.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Cockney and a Scouser. What mischief could we get up to?
Oh, I can find a couple of things.
Thank you. Much love.
Thank you. Thanks, Maria.
Bye.